Greetings, all 915 adventurers of the realm. My name is Jakin, and today we're going to go over the checks and saves in DC20. If you're new to tabletop RPGs, you might be asking yourself, what are checks and saves? Let's start with answering the first part of that question. What are checks? In DC20, when a creature initiates an action against another creature or an obstacle, the Game Master, or GM, might call on them to make a check to determine if their activity is successful. That's a bunch of fancy jargon for just saying, roll some dice to see how well you do. In DC20, there are 5 checks a GM might ask a player to make. Flat attribute checks, attack checks, spell checks, skill checks, and trade checks. Let's start with a flat check. In order to make a flat check, you're going to roll a d20 and add the relevant attribute. These are typically only used when a player performs a task that doesn't benefit from a mastery. Check out last week's video to learn how masteries work in DC20. When your character is in battle, you might take the attack action. At this point, the GM will ask you to make an attack check. In order to do so, you're going to roll your d20, add your prime modifier, and add your combat mastery. There's also a handy spot on the character sheet where this is simplified for you. But maybe you're not a martial character and instead decide to do a spell attack. In this case, the GM will call for you to roll a spell check. This uses the same formula used for the attack check, a d20 plus your prime modifier plus combat mastery. Next is, in my opinion, the most common type of check in the game: skill checks. Anytime you attempt a test of skill, the GM will call on you to make a skill check to determine if it was successful or not. In order to do so, roll your d20 and add your relevant attribute plus your skill mastery. Again, this is simplified for you on the character sheet. But if you attempt a test of professional expertise, the GM might call on you to make a trade check. This is going to be a d20 plus the attribute associated with the trade plus your trade mastery. Finally, when your character attempts to speak, write, or read a language that they have limited mastery in, the GM will call on you to make a language check, which is a d20 plus charisma or intelligence, whichever is higher. Now that you have an understanding of checks in DC20, it's time to get familiar with check categories. In the game, checks are organized into 3 categories: physical checks, mystical checks, and martial checks. A mystical check includes any check that requires a creature's focus to perform, like a charisma check, intelligence check, or spell check. Again, this can also include skill or trade checks that use charisma or intelligence. Martial checks are called for when a creature performs a task that could benefit from either an athletics or acrobatics check. When the GM calls for you to make a martial check, you can choose between the 2. Personally, I go with whichever has the better bonus for my roll. I'm not 100% sure if it's meant to be played this way, but check categories have been a blessing for me as a GM. My players in my home game can be pretty chaotic and often ask to do some pretty weird things. This requires a lot of on-the-spot thinking, and in those on-the-spot moments, I often default to either a physical check or a mystical check. It saves so much time and helps keep the game moving forward. Now let's discuss a special kind of check called a check contest. This is when a creature makes a check against an opposing creature's check or saves. More on saves later in the video. To do a check contest, both creatures will make the relevant check, and whoever rolls the highest result wins. If the result ends in a tie, then the situation remains unchanged. Sometimes in DC20, a GM might not ask a player to roll any dice for a check. In this scenario, a GM might use the passive value of a skill, aka passive skills. The value of a passive skill is going to be equal to 8 plus all of the bonuses applied to that check. If your character has an effect that grants them a permanent advantage or disadvantage on a skill check, then you will add or subtract 5 for each instance of advantage or disadvantage. More on those later. Before we move on to saves, I want to take a moment and say thank you for watching this video and making it this far. If you aren't already, consider subscribing and liking the video. Your support helps keeps this series going and helps me get other projects off the ground, like maybe a one-shot? Subscribe to find out more. In DC20, when a player reacts against an effect that's being forced upon them, the GM might call on them to make a save to determine if they are successful at resisting the effect or not. This game has 4 types of saves: might saves, agility saves, charisma saves, and intelligence saves. These are considered attribute saves. To make an attribute save, roll a d20 and add your relevant attribute bonus plus combat mastery, if applicable. Much like checks, Saves can be organized into 3 categories: physical saves, mystical saves, and death saves. Timeout. What the hell is a death save? We'll dive more into health in a later video, but basically, when your character drops down to 0 health points, or HP, they make death saves at the end of their turn. To make a death save, roll a d20. If the result is a 10 or higher, then you succeed the save. You'll make death saves until your character is restored to 1 HP, is stabilized, or dies. Physical saves are for when an effect targets your overall physical abilities. Your physical save bonus will be equal to your might save bonus or your agility save bonus, whichever is higher. Mystical saves are for when an effect targets your overall mystical abilities. Your mystical save bonus will be equal to either your charisma save bonus or your intelligence save bonus, whichever is higher. In the game, every character has a save DC. This is basically how hard it is for you to take on static effects like traps or ongoing effects like spells. Your save DC is going to be 10 plus your prime modifier plus your combat mastery. Again, this is simplified for you on the character sheet. With all of this in mind, let's discuss dynamic attack saves. These come from game features like maneuvers, techniques, spell casting, and both deal damage and impose effects on a target. The provoking creature makes an attack or spell check at the same time the target is making its save. The result of the attack or spell check is then compared to the target's defense to determine if damage is dealt, and then the target's save is then compared to the provoking creature's save DC to determine if it takes on an effect. Dynamic attack saves can result in one of 4 outcomes. The target takes damage and is subject to the effect. The target does not take damage and is subjected to the effect. The target takes damage but is not subjected to the effect. Or the target does not take damage and is not subjected to the effect. Checks and saves are a huge part of DC20. But arguably just as important are the concepts of advantage and disadvantage. Whenever a creature has advantage, you roll 2 d20s and take the highest roll. When a creature has disadvantage, you roll 2 d20s and take the lowest roll. Because of the many ways to get advantage on checks and saves, advantage and disadvantage stack. This means that a creature might have multiple sources of advantage and disadvantage on a single roll. Let's say that I'm making an attack check and have advantage 3. That would mean that in addition to my attack die, I would roll 3 more d20s. The d20 that rolls the highest result is the one that I will use on the attack check. Again, the same logic applies if this were disadvantage. Sometimes there might be instances where a creature has advantage and disadvantage at the same time. In this case, they will cancel each other out. If they all cancel out, a creature will make a standard d20 roll as usual. If there are any remaining advantage or disadvantage, you would then make that roll with whatever's left over. I really hope you paid attention in math class. One thing to keep in mind when attempting a check over and over again is the multiple check penalty. Your first attempt at a check, like athletics for example, will be a normal roll. However, for each additional attempt at athletics before the end of your turn, you'll add disadvantage. I'm a big fan of this concept because it really is a representation of wearing yourself out within a matter of seconds. Again, there are several ways to gain advantage in this game, but we're gonna go over that in another video. Let's move on to the last topic of the video, check and save outcomes. For those of you who have played other D20 fantasy systems like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, you'll be no stranger to this concept. When a creature rolls a 20 on a D20, they gain a critical success. When a creature rolls a 1 on a D20, they suffer a critical failure. When you gain a critical success, or as the cool people call it, a natural 20. On a save, skill check, or trade check, you automatically succeed even if the result would normally fail. If you suffer a critical failure, or a natural 1, on a save, skill check, or trade check, then you automatically fail even if the result would succeed. When it comes to attacks and spell checks, the same concept can be applied, but with a few key differences. For example, a critical success on an attack or spell check results in a critical hit, which gives you a +2 damage on top of whatever damage you're already dealing. A critical failure on an attack or spell check means that any action points or mana points that were spent are lost, but any additional resources used are not spent. Additionally, a creature that suffers a critical failure is considered exposed until the end of their next turn. This means that all opponents attacking you have advantage. Ouch. Another one of my favorite aspects of this system are the degrees of success and failure. We all know that if a roll meets or beats a DC, then it succeeds. But there are some features in the game that have cool things that happen for every 5 you beat the DC by. For example, in combat, attacks deal bonus damage for every increment of 5 that you go over their physical defense. And just like that, you now have a basic understanding of how checks and saves work in DC20. If you liked what you saw and want to grab a copy of the alpha rules for yourself, I've included a link to the Kickstarter in the description and pinned comment. This isn't a sponsored video or anything, but this is a system that I'm very passionate about, if you can't tell already. Want to learn more about the rules of DC20? Check out these other videos that we made. I think you'll like them. I'll see you in the next video.